Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 99, The Prince of the Upper Palace. This is the second episode focused on the famous prince known as Prince Shōtoku Taishi. Last episode, we went over the various stories that are told about the prince in the various histories, as well as some of the temple records. Of course, it is generally agreed that most, if perhaps not all, of the information on Prince Shōtoku Taishi, which is to say, the crown prince of great virtue, is at best exaggerated and at worst is completely made up at a later time by people deliberately trying to appropriate his story. Unfortunately, it is extremely difficult to tell what is pure fiction and what might be some semblance of reality, but we'll give it a try as best we can. I will say there is a lot that has been written about Shotoku Taishi and his alter egos, that is Prince Umayado, aka Prince Kamitsumiya, aka Toyotomimi no Mikoto. A lot more has been written than I really have time to delve into. Besides various sources in Japanese, one of, if not the most extensive look at sources mentioning the prince is probably by Dr. Herman Bonner in the 1930s and 40s. However, his work, which I am told is 1,000 pages in length, is also entirely in German. I'm not sure anything quite that extensive has been written in English, and furthermore, other works out there, like Michael Komo's own work, Shotoku, Ethnicity, Ritual, and Violence in the Japanese Buddhist Tradition, often speak more to what the stories of Shotoku Taishi say about the developments in Japanese culture over time, focusing on the cult of Shotoku and what it said about Japan, rather than focusing on the individual Shotoku Taishi himself. I'm not going to have time to read all of the sources and condense them down for you, but I'm also not sure that's exactly necessary. Just be aware that there's a lot of ink that's been spilled over Shotoku Taishi in one way or another. As for theories on the actual prince, they vary widely. Some say that there was indeed a powerful figure at court known as Prince Umayado, or alternatively as the Prince of the Upper Chamber, and he may have even been the crown prince in line to inherit the throne had he not tragically passed away before the death of the current sovereign, Kashikiya Hime, aka Suiko Tenno. Others suggest that the portrait we have is actually a composite, the work of many different individuals, all wrapped up in the guise of a single, powerful individual who instituted sweeping changes across the archipelago and single-handedly gave birth to the Japanese state. Of course, there are also those who accept the story as true, as written, or at least as true as the rest of that period of history. For my part, I believe I'm closer to the ideas proposed in 1999 by Oyama Seichiro in his book, Shotoku Taishi no Tanjo, who suggested there was likely an actual Prince Umayado, but that his story was exaggerated by the compilers of the Nihon Shoki and by later groups who were promoting the Shotoku cult. By the way, when I mention the Shotoku cult, I want to be clear what I mean. Cult in this instance is more like a cult of personality. It encompasses the various ideas that people held about the prince, true or otherwise. However, it should be noted that until more recently, it is unlikely that anyone would have claimed to have been a part of any kind of cult or group with specific Shotoku Taishi related beliefs. Rather, the prince's story was, to many of them, simply a fact, even as they consciously or unconsciously embellished the story. In fact, we often blame the compilers of the Nihon Shoki for adding to the prince's story, but it's just as likely that they were simply going off of other sources that also had recorded these same things. So given all of that, who was the real Prince Umayado? We're told that Umayado's name comes because his pregnant mother gave birth to him as she was wandering around during her pregnancy and suddenly delivered him in front of the office of the horse stables, the Umayado. He's also known as Prince Kamitsumiya, or the Prince of the Upper Palace. This was because, we are told, before he was made crown prince and given the crown prince's quarters as his own, his father had installed him in the upper hall of the South Palace in his own complex. The name Toyotomimi no Mikoto is less obvious, but more similar to the types of names we had seen in previous generations of sovereigns, and likely a kind of titular name, combining various accolades and titles together. That last one gets to a tricky bit about Prince Umayado. Was he actually of royal birth? And was he the son of a previous sovereign? As noted last episode, we're told that Umayado's father was Tachibana no Toyoi, himself the son of Ame Kuniyoshi Hiraki Niwa no Ookimi, aka Kimmei Tenno. His mother, Kitashi Hime, was the daughter of Soga no Iname. We've already noted how the Soga family really wormed their way into the royal line. Theoretically, sovereigns were supposed to come from a queen that was herself of royal blood, the previous exception to this being Iwa no Hime, daughter of Katsuraki no Sotsuhiko and wife to O Sasaki no Ookimi, aka Nintoku Tenno. However, that seems to have stopped being an issue since about the time of Ame Kuniyoshi's father, Ohoro no Ookimi, aka Keitai Tenno. After all, first two of his sons to succeed him to the throne were the sons of Menoko, herself the daughter of Awari no Muraji no Kusaka. Not exactly a name boasting a royal lineage. To be fair, the Nihon Shoki only claimed that they were holding the throne for their more properly titled brother Ame Kuniyoshi, so take that as you will. Ame Kuniyoshi married 3 of his own nieces, daughters of his brothers, which may have been an attempt to smooth out some of the kinks in the royal line. He also married at least 2, possibly 3 daughters of Soga no Iname, and they produced several sovereigns. One of these, of course, is Tachibana no Toyoi, aka Yomei Tenno, but there was also Hatsebe no Wakasazaki, aka Sushun Tenno, and finally there was Kashikiya Hime, aka Suiko Tenno, though one could argue that she held her place as much because she had been the consort, or even queen, to her stepbrother, Nunakura Futodamashiki, aka Bidatsu Tenno. Should be noted, though, that both Hatsebe no Wakasazaki and Kashikiya Hime came to the throne during a period of political violence. There was the Soga and Mononobe conflict, which included a genuine fight for the throne which spilled out into the general public. And this all reads as the results of Soga no Iname, and then later Soga no Umako, maneuvering to put the Soga family in power to rule the country. That they succeeded in getting 2 Soga relatives on the throne, even if Umako then assassinated Hasebe when he proved too difficult to control, well, it would seem to indicate that the Soga gambit had been pretty effective, and they had overcome the traditions that previously had been designed to limit who had direct access to the power of the throne. Of course, there are questions of just how old and how accurate that tradition was. I mean, for all we know, the previous queens had simply had their lineage updated to ensure that they were of proper royal birth. But I still think it's telling that it seemed to be important, at least to the people recording the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki. Now, how does all that relate to Umayado? Well, as I mentioned, his father was Tachibana no Toyoi. Just like Kashikiya Hime and Hasebe, he was the son of Ame Kuniyoshi no Ookimi and one of his Soga wives. In fact, it wouldn't be surprising had Toyoi taken the throne, given who else did. However, I do wonder if that ever actually even happened. The Nihon Shoki only places him on the throne briefly, about 2 years, and during that time, there was still a lot of conflict going on. The idea that there had been a consensus and that Tachibana no Toyoi was chosen as the next Ookimi already seems a bit questionable, at least to me. Then there's also his supposed Misasagi, or tomb. We're told that he was buried at Shinaga, and this tomb has been identified and is still known today, presumably. Given the records from then until now, while it is possible that the tomb was mistaken at some point over the intervening centuries, I would propose that its identification is probably fairly reliable, especially as it also is said to be the tomb of Prince Umayado. However, there's a bit of a problem, and it's that the tomb is not a round keyhole-shaped tomb, as would be expected of a royal tomb up to that time. Instead, it is a square-shaped tomb. Now, why is this notable? Well, because the royal tombs up through Ame Kuniyoshi, aka Kinmei Tenno and his son, Nunakura no Okimi, aka Bidatsu Tenno, are for the most part round keyhole shaped tombs, the Zenpo Koen, or flat front and round backed kofun. Even through different dynasties, the shape and size of the kofun seem to hold true. However, that stops with Tachibana no Toyoi. His tomb is square shaped, which is much more similar to individuals other than the royal family. Complicating matters somewhat, though, it isn't just his tomb where we see this change. Suddenly, we see a bunch of square tombs that are designated as royal tombs. These include the tombs of Tachibana no Toyoi, aka Yomei Tenno, Hasebe no Wakasazaki, aka Sushun Tenno, and Kashikiya Hime, aka Suiko Tenno. All of their identified tombs appear to be square tombs similar to the tomb identified with Sogono Umiko, Ishibutai Kofun. So, why the sudden switch? It is not directly stated, but this may have been a part of all the other changes in court and ritual that were happening at the time. In succeeding generations, we see 8-sided kofun and even round kofun, and all for verified sovereigns. So it is entirely possible that it is at Yomei where the tradition of keyhole-shaped royal kofun abruptly ended. But I'm still rather skeptical about a lot of this. I wonder if the shape of Tachibana no Toyoi's kofun indicates that it was just the kofun for a powerful member of the Soga lineage, just like Umiko's kofun. However, I must admit, it doesn't directly contradict the sources that say he was Tenno, since the following sovereigns are also recorded as having square-shaped tombs. Then again, there's a bit of a question on just about all of them, and as far as how much they reigned and what power they held, vice what power was in the hands of Sogono Umiko. And for the succeeding generations, well, as I mentioned, there are other shapes as well. For instance, that octagonal kofun, and an 8-sided kofun would actually match up well with a growing belief in Buddhism, where 8 is an extremely auspicious number. I mean, it's enough so that people in some Asian countries will actually pay more for license plates or phone numbers with multiple 8s in the number, along with other auspicious digits. And there's another factor that might explain why they moved to a less complex kofun shape. I've mentioned in past episodes that the temple building craze of the early 600s really killed off kofun construction. We see resources that would have gone to venerating important figures and building their tombs, the likely center of their ritual veneration, instead go to the building of temples. In many ways, temples became the better and more lasting memorial for any wealthy individual, especially since temples themselves could grow and change with the times, whereas a giant mound of earth, cool as it is, was a bit hard to modify, let alone relocate. I also suspect that the change in various rituals also meant that the previous shape of the kofun, that round keyhole shape, may not have been as important in later periods. If we assume that shape had something to do with the focus of conducting regular rituals at the site, for which purpose certain families were actually employed in hereditary positions, then moving away from that shape would suggest, to me at least, that there was a change in the rituals as well. However, that change was coming much earlier than the temples, at least should we choose to believe the chronology given to us in the Nihon Shoki. So, while it explains in broad strokes the move away from kofun practice, it doesn't satisfactorily explain everything that we're seeing at this period. And that brings me back to my hesitation to say that Tachibana no Toyoi was ever an actual sovereign or Okimi of Yamato. The main thing about Tachibana no Toyoi's ascension that really gets to me is it feels rather contrived. There isn't a lot said about him. I can only think that perhaps this was done in order to make sure that Prince Umayado had the necessary pedigree for everything else that people were going to be saying about him. As awesome as he wasn't going to be nearly so incredible if he didn't have a lineage which put him in line to inherit the throne. But I could very easily be wrong, especially if some of our sources aren't exactly in order And we've seen in other places where it appears that individuals were either raised up as sovereigns or possibly co sovereigns, individuals who reigned at the same time, and they may have had their reigns massaged to conform with the desired narrative. Which brings up another question. Was Umayado ever actually named as crown prince? Was he truly in line to succeed Kashikiya Hime? Not sure that is as black and white. I've noted before, why would Kashikiya Hime have chosen him over other potential candidates? Even if his father wasn't sovereign, he was still a royal prince of Soga lineage, but Kashikiya Hime also had her own children, at least according to the Chronicles. So, where were they? I'm not sure, but for whatever reason, I am inclined to believe that Prince Umayado may have indeed been either the crown prince or in a position so close that it didn't warrant a distinction. That said, it might be interesting to look a little bit more at some of those early records, such as the Gankoji Garan Engi, and see just how he's referred to there. There are plenty of stories about Prince Umayado that I believe we can take as true, if only in part. I have no reason not to believe, for instance, that he was an avid supporter of continental learning, including Buddhism and other teachings. That was all new and exciting, and with the direction that the Yamato state was taking at the time, it would have been useful and provided the prince some clout and notoriety. It's also quite possible that he penned one or more commentaries on various sutras, though how good or insightful it would have been, I have no idea, and whether it was his own words or if perhaps he patronized a temple to help write them for him, I couldn't say. Also not sure if the ones that we have currently attributed to him are accurate. I don't know that there's anything definitive one way or the other. I might even go so far as to suggest that he played a role in helping to lay out the 17-article Constitution and maybe championed a version of the continental rank system, but I doubt he just made it up himself out of whole cloth. There were no doubt more than a few scribes at this point who had read various works from the continent and were able to help pull the various concepts of good government together and grab all those nice, juicy continental-style quotes. I doubt he was the one putting pen to paper for all of it, but who knows? Perhaps, though, the most likely case for his existence comes in the form of the temple Horyuji, said to have been built on the site of his former estate, and the woven mandala that's said to have been commissioned by one of his own consorts. These are rather compelling to me because they both physically exist, even if in a diminished state. And for Horyuji, we can look back at the archaeological evidence as well as any extant buildings or images and just see when it was built. For the Tenju Kokushucho mandala, though, we have some of the original fragments, along with some fragments of a later copy, but we also have copies of the inscription that was on the mandala. It's possible that the transcription we have is somehow not correct, but that would be odd since the object was on display for people to see and remained intact through at least the Kamakura period, one assumes, since that's when they made a copy of it. So let's examine both of these a little bit more in depth. The Horyuji temple is said to have been built by Prince Umayado on his estate, but it was supposedly built for his father, Tachibana no Toyoi. In fact, Horyuji was apparently supposed to be his temple, that is, Tachibana Toyoi's temple. Tachibana no Toyoi, suffering from illness, is said to have vowed to build a temple, but he died before he could complete it. Prince Umayado's eventual work to build Horyuji is said to have been an act of filial piety as much as it was one of Buddhist piety, as it was dedicated originally to Yakushi Nyorai, a Buddha associated with healing illness, and it was built for his father, we're told, the great king Tachibana no Toyoi. And we see several times the idea of building a temple on a noble family's personal compound. Soga no Iname is the first to convert his house, or some portion, and Soga no Umeko eventually succeeds with Hokoji, aka Asukadera. It makes sense that Horyuji was also built on land donated by an elite member of society, and everything points to it being this Prince Umayado, or one of his alter egos. In fact, it would be rather odd to build it on land that wasn't already built up in some way. I mean, even Shitennoji was built, so we're told, on a compound that formerly belonged to the Mononobe, a rather large middle finger, or perhaps an inverted V extended by the Soga to those whom history labeled as the anti-Buddhist faction of the early court. We also have nearby Chuguji, literally the Middle Palace Temple, which was, we're told, built on the site of Prince Umayado's mother's home. I'm not sure if we can verify that entirely, but the fact that it is known as the Middle Palace Temple suggests some connection to an elite's compound and palace, the Nakatsumiya, which goes right along with Umayado's Kamitsumiya. The two were close and became only closer with time, though they did retain their own characteristics. And so, Horyuji was quite likely built on the site of someone's palace, and if it wasn't the prince we know as Umayado, then who was it? At the very least, we have some person that may at least be a part of the legion that makes up the legend of Shotoku Taishi. Now, as for the Tenju Koku Shucho Mandala, for that we have the inscription from the mandala itself. We are told that Tachibana no Iratsume asked Kashikiya Hime to commission it for her departed husband, Prince Toyotomimi. As far as I can tell, this inscription, found in the Jogu Shotoku Ho Teisetsu, a biography of Shotoku Taishi, is considered an accurate transcription of the 400 or so characters that were on the original curtain. If that is the case, then we have an inscription from shortly after his death attesting to the existence of a Prince Toyotomimi, and it even gives part of his lineage, including mention of Tachibana no Toyoi, whom we are told was indeed a sovereign, though we don't know when or for how long, so that would seem to support the assertions in the Nihon Shoki about Tachibana no Toyoi's status. Now, the biography, at least as it comes down to us, was likely compiled sometime in the 10th or 11th century, which makes a lot of its information suspect, but I generally think we can trust the transcription from the mandala. After all, we have pretty good evidence for the artifact still existing when the biography was compiled. The fact that the artifact seems pretty clearly made in the Asuka period, so in the 7th century at least, not soon after Toyotomimi's death, further adds to the reliability in my estimation. That isn't to say they didn't pick and choose what they were going to report in the biography itself, but for me, there's little reason to doubt that this inscription isn't what was actually on the mandala. On the other hand, we still don't have a lot of information about Prince Umayado or Toyotomimi or his father, Tachibana no Toyoi, though it does say he was a sovereign. So apparently he came to the throne, other things largely happened around him, and then he died of illness, based on what we know. So perhaps Tachibana was a short-lived sovereign after all. I'm honestly still on the fence about it, but the more I read, the more I come around to the idea that that still doesn't explain how his son ended up being remembered so well. All in all, I suspect that most of Shotoku Taishi's story is rooted in truths and facts about this era. He may indeed have been the crown prince, or at least an influential one. He likely was on top of the craze in Buddhist and continental learning, and he may have even played some role in helping to govern the country. Still, how did he come to outshine the others who had almost equal claims on all of this change? For one thing, there's Kashikiya Hime. She was smart, capable, and the one actually seated on the throne. Unfortunately, I suspect that she had two major impediments to taking on the mantle that Shotoku Taishi eventually donned. For one thing, she was a woman. Unfortunately, along with continental ideas would come an increase in continental misogyny, though it would take some time to reach the same level, and there would still be female sovereigns ruling alongside male sovereigns for some time. However, she was also the sovereign, and that likely meant that her reputation, such as it was caught up in the push and pull of court politics. Even within the royal family, there were different factions and different people aiming for the throne, and so she may not have had the universal support for sainthood. This may not have been as much of a problem had she herself, like Prince Umayado, passed away early and young, but she lived and reigned a good long while and probably pissed more than a few people off. And then besides her, there's the other major mover and shaker of the period, Sogono Umiko. Of just about anyone other than the sovereigns, Sogono Umiko seems to have been the best positioned to provide the kind of guidance, patronage, and more that was likely making reality of many of the things which Shotoku Taishi received credit, including his own temple of Hokoji. Sogono Umiko had an almost bigger problem than Kashikiya Hime, however. He led the forces against the Mononobe and their allies, and many of those allies would lick their wounds and come back to power. Even the Mononobe were still around, if not guiding the government. Furthermore, listeners who've been reading ahead in the story will likewise know that it was the Fujiwara family that eventually would control the court for centuries. In fact, for many students of Japanese history, the Soga are not exactly portrayed as paragons of virtue who helped introduce Buddhism to Japan, but rather as a greedy family that didn't know their place and who went beyond the bounds of what we consider acceptable behavior. As such, I doubt Sogono Umiko was in much of a position to be venerated by large swaths of the population. In the end, it was probably the fact that he died early that allowed Prince Toyotomimi, aka Prince Umayado, to become the venerated figure he is today. To quote eminent Gotham lawyer Harvey Dent, "You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain." Sure enough, Prince Umayado died at a point where likely the public could still imagine all of the good that he could have done. Meanwhile, both Kashikiya Hime and Umiko had been through some stuff, and they'd done what they needed to gain and maintain power. It may have been a recipe for their success, but it didn't necessarily make them universally beloved. I suspect that in the end, the lack of information about Prince Umayado, along with some key bits of likely true information, allowed people to build him up into what they needed him to be, a culture hero that could embody the ideals that Yamato was adopting and adapting from the continent. He had the prestige, a royal prince, and perhaps even a crown prince. And he was involved with this new culture that was being imported and updated. Of course, this is largely speculation. In the end, it is hard to know what are the true facts around this legendary figure. I think the best we can really say is that there likely was an Shotoku, an original prince who may or may not have been known as either Prince Umayado, Prince Kamitsumiya, or even Prince Toyotomimi. And one or more of those names may even have belonged to different people. And so we're largely left with a question and with the legend. But in that legend, there is a plethora of information, if not about the actual human being, then about the changes that were happening in the Yamato court and in society as a whole. Regardless of all of the exact details, the 7th century would be extremely critical in the history of Yamato, setting the path for the future. One which we'll be diving into episode by episode as we continue our trek through the histories. For now, I think I'll leave you here. For those listening to this when it comes out, I wish you the best in this holiday-filled season from about November to February, whatever you may be celebrating. And if you feel like giving, I hope you'll forgive me if I reiterate that I do this out of love of history, and so we pay for all of the expenses ourselves. So any donations that people like to throw our way are always appreciated. However, first and foremost, please take care of yourselves and those around you. And so, until next time, thank you for listening, and thank you sincerely for all of your support. Again, if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends. Feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you feel the need this season to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo. Or you can find the links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we'll have more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, as always, feel free to tweet at us at Sengoku Podcast or reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. That's all for now, so Thank you once again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.